Hello everyone, my name is Kebir Colmenero, and today I'm going to be presenting my paper, The Native Speaker Ideology Under Scrutiny, Perspectives Concerning the Minority and the Foreign Language, together with my supervisor, David Lasagabaster, and I hope you enjoy it. The division of language users depending on the native or non-native criteria has been a controversial issue in linguistics. It constructs a binary classification of speakers, where speakers can be either native speakers or non-native speakers. But which are the criteria used to assign or label a particular speaker? Scholars have used the following criteria. So first, language proficiency, so how proficient you are in this language. Then the cultural and the social knowledge linked to this language, so are you familiar with it or not? Then the order of language acquisition, so is it your first language, is it your second language, is it your third language? And finally, the place of birth. So are you born in a country where this is the first language and the official language or not? Still, the task of assigning a native or non-native label is much more complex. Taking geographical differences as the major criteria, back in 1985, Katru portrayed three types of countries depending on the acquisition, role, and type of spread of English. First, we have inner circle countries, which are those countries where English is the primary language, let's say. So everybody born in this country and taking English as his first language is a native speaker. If we move on, non-native speakers would be speakers of outer circle and expanded circle countries. In the case of outer circle, these are countries that have been previously colonized by an inner circle territory, and as a result of this, English is institutionalized and is used in education and administrative fields. For instance, Singapore or India. And finally, expanding circle countries will be those countries that have taken English as their major international language but haven't undergone any kind of colonization by an inner circle territory, like China or Poland. So, despite this description, the current use of English depicts a completely different situation. Nowadays, English keeps increasing its number of speakers, and it has become the most expanded language worldwide. If we take a look at the number of speakers, we can observe that there are 388 million native speakers and 1.8 billion non-native speakers. So what these numbers indicate is that for every native speaker of English, there are 4.5 non-native speakers of English. And what these numbers indicate is that nowadays English is more used as a second language or as a foreign language between non-native speakers than as a first language. Therefore, we can say that nowadays English is evolving towards its use as a lingua franca, that is, a language used to reach understanding between speakers of different first languages. Despite this situation, there's a hot debate in English language teaching between native and non-native speaking teachers in order to decide which one is the best teacher. And research has tried to assign some positive and negative aspects to each type of teacher. In the case of native speaking teachers, they have been praised for their superior language proficiency and wider vocabulary range. They have also been positively valued for having a deeper knowledge of the culture related to English and for their superior accent or pronunciation. Still, they have been criticized for lacking to their first language and for the cultural gaps experienced between students with their culture and native speaking teachers with their culture. In the case of non-native speaking teachers, they have been praised for sharing the album with their students and for using it during their teaching, for their teaching skills, and for having experienced learning English as a second or foreign language. And as a result of this, they have developed some superior empathy, let's say, and the teaching of some strategies which are helpful to students. Still, they have been criticized for not having such a proficient level of English, for not having such a wide vocabulary range, and for not being that familiar with the culture related to English in this case. And they have also been negatively viewed for the influence of their first language on their English accent. Apart from these characteristics, research has also proven that despite supporting team teaching approaches where both native and non-native teachers work together, there's an overall preference for native speaking teachers. So all these characteristics about nativeness have only been examined in English. But are they exclusive to English, or is this the case also in the teaching of other languages? So that's what we're going to try to investigate with this study. In order to examine this difference, we'll be analyzing nativeness both in English and in Basque. And what is Basque? Basque is a minority language spoken by Basque in the northern region of Spain and southwestern of France. Here in Spain it has a co-official status with Spanish, and it's spoken by around 750,000 speakers, more or less. Here in the Basque Country, the vast majority of students are enrolled either in Basque medium schools, that is, schools that are completely taught where everything is completely taught in Basque, or in bilingual schools, where both Spanish and Basque are mixed. There are 5 major Basque dialects, and they sometimes show a high degree of cross-dialectical divergence, which means that sometimes communication between different dialects is different. In order to avoid this, and to ensure the survival of the language, back in 1968, the Academy of the Basque Language created a standard, which is the one that is taught in schools, used in the media and public administrations. If we take a look at the literature on the topic, what we can see is that nativeness has been examined either with students or with teachers, so gathering data from these two groups, and using questionnaires or focus groups. However, to our knowledge, no other study has examined nativeness in a different language and comparing it with English and using a mixed method approach. So that's what we came up with this idea. So, taking into account the previously conducted research, we came up with the following 2 research questions. So first, do students prefer native speaker teachers or non-native speaker teachers in Basque and English? And does this preference change according to the language level of the course? And then, do students perceive advantages and disadvantages in having an English and a Basque native or non-native speaker teachers, and if so, in which areas? Our study was conducted in the Basque Autonomous Country, and we gathered data from 355 secondary and high school students. And we used both questionnaires and focus groups. In the case of questionnaires, we designed our own questionnaire, but it was based on other questionnaires used in the field. Here you have a screenshot from students' questionnaire. So we first had some control variables like age, gender, first language. Then we had a set of items, a set of multiple choice items. And then finally, a list of items on a 5-point Likert scale. These items were subdivided into 4 categories. So assessment and support, attitudes and motivation, culture, and perceived linguistic abilities. An average mean for each item plus an average mean for the whole category was calculated. When analyzing responses to Likert items, values close to 3, between 2.85 and 3.15, will be regarded as responses where the native factor does not play a significant role, since they are close to the 3 in the scale, which means they nor agree nor disagree. So, as for our first research question, so these are the students' responses to their overall preferences when it comes to native, non-native, or the team teaching approach where both types of teachers work together. If we take a look at these numbers, we can observe that both English and Basque students have a preference for native speaker teachers. Still, a closer look indicates that values supporting team teaching approaches, where both native and non-native teachers work together, are highly supported by students. And finally, if we take a look at the responses to non-native speaker teacher preferences, we can observe that there's a significant difference between these values and the ones supporting native speaker teachers. So we can say that there's an overall preference for native speaker teachers. When it comes to differences depending on the language level of the course, these are our responses. So we gathered data from both Basque and English students, and depending on the 3 learning stages, so beginner, intermediate, and advanced. We can observe the same teacher preferences across the 2 languages. So at beginner levels, both students in English and in Basque prefer non-native speaker teachers. Then, at intermediate levels, they appear to move to both types of teachers, so to the team teaching approach. And finally, at advanced learning stages, they seem to shift to native speaker teachers. So, what this indicates is that there's a preference for non-native speaker teachers at beginner levels, for both types of teachers at intermediate levels, and for native speaker teachers at advanced levels. These numbers seem to indicate that the higher the proficiency level, the more necessary a native speaker teacher is for students. And this was also indicated in focus groups, where somehow students indicated that non-native speaker teachers have limited English language teaching and Basque language teaching abilities that make them unable to go beyond intermediate levels, as you can see in this quote. If we take a closer look at the data, we can observe that preferences for native speaker teachers are higher in English than in Basque. And this was also mentioned in focus groups, where students mentioned that the international language use of English was the reason behind this preference, as you can see in this quote. In our second research question, we were interested in examining the preferences for native and non-native speaker teachers in specific areas. Our results in our first category, assessment and support, appear to indicate that both Basque students and English students prefer native speaker teachers for this category, for assessment and support. A closer look at individual items reveals that students, both in the case of English and in the case of Basque, have a preference for native speaker teachers' assessment of reading, writing, and speaking, as well as for their support with additional notes and materials. In addition, all students believe that non-native speaker teachers were better for the assessment of listening. Responses to item 18 show that all students reject the effect of nativeness in teacher problem-solving abilities. Students' testimonies in focus groups reveal that they believe that these problem-solving abilities are teacher-specific, rather than related to their native or non-native condition. As it can be illustrated in this quote, where one of our students indicate that it doesn't matter if he or she is a native or non-native teacher, but what it's important is if he or she is a good teacher. The attitude and motivation category revealed differences in the two languages. While non-native speaker teachers were preferred in the case of Basque, the role of nativeness was discarded in the case of English, as for overall responses. If we take a closer look, we can observe that native speaker teachers were perceived as generators of more positive attitudes towards the speakers of English and Basque, as well as towards the places where these languages were spoken. In the case of non-native speaker teachers, we can observe that students believe that they would have less language difficulties and more positive attitudes towards learning both English and Basque if taught by a non-native speaker teachers. As mentioned in focus groups, non-natives' experience as language learners may be helpful in the students' learning process. This is a quote that illustrates what we just mentioned. So they, non-native speaker teachers, have gone through the same stages and they can understand your situation and what you don't understand. However, different responses were observed in students' motivation when being taught by a native or a non-native speaker teacher in the two languages. In the case of Basque, they discarded the effect of nativeness, and in the case of English, there was a preference for native speaker teachers. Students' responses in focus groups shed some light on the topic. In this case, English native speaker teachers' lack of students' first language may create a new scenario for students, where they have to make an effort to make themselves understood and to understand their teachers while using the language. In such situations, students may feel more motivated by this upcoming challenge, as illustrated by this quote. However, the thing is that this is not the case in Basque. Why? Because most, if not all, Basque teachers know Spanish, apart from Basque. In our third category, culture, overall results appear to indicate that students discard the effect of nativeness, both for the teaching of the cultural aspects of Basque and English. Still, students agree with the fact that native speaker teachers are the best option to teach the history, tradition, and culture related to each language. But that's not necessary. Being native speaker teachers is not necessary to be able to transmit these aspects. So non-native speaker teachers can also do it. In the case of Basque, students admit that its context is different from the English one. Why? Because in the case of Basque, both native speakers and non-native speakers of Basque live together within the Basque Autonomous Country. And this was illustrated in the focus groups, where students said that it's the same because both native speaker teachers and non-native speaker teachers live in the same place. Not like English, in which we have non-native speaker teachers from Spain teaching the language and native speaker teachers from the UK or the US, as mentioned by this student. In our last category, perceived linguistic abilities, there was an overall preference for native speaker teachers, both in English and in Basque. In addition, all students, regardless of the language, agreed with the fact that native speaker teachers are better for the teaching of vocabulary, listening, grammar, fluency, and pronunciation. Still, all participants agreed with the fact that non-native speaking teachers are good examples of how to learn English. This belief that non-native speaker teachers are good examples of how to learn English was also illustrated in focus groups, where one of our students said that non-native speaker teachers have studied the language and they know how to speak it correctly, and therefore, as a student, they would like to master the language like him or her. So taking all this into consideration, we came up to the following conclusions. So, for our first research questions, the one concerning, do students prefer native speaker teachers or non-native speaker teachers in Basque and English, and does this change depending on the language level of the course? Students' responses appear to indicate that there's a preference for non-native speaker teachers at beginner levels, for both type of teachers at intermediate levels, and for native speaker teachers at advanced levels. So what this indicates is that the higher the level, the more necessary a native speaker teacher is for students, regardless of the language. So these responses, arguing that the higher the level, the more necessary a native speaker teacher is, have also been found in previous studies in the field, but they were only in the case of English. So what our study brings to the research field is that this preference, this level-dependent preference, is regardless of the language, as it has been also witnessed in the case of Basque. So what this situation also depicts is somehow that native speaker teachers have a superior position in comparison to non-native speaker teachers. Why? Because non-native speaker teachers' teaching abilities cannot make them able to go beyond intermediate levels of English language and Basque language teaching. In our second research question, we were interested in analyzing the advantages and disadvantages associated to each type of teacher. Following the approach that has been traditionally taken in the field, we analyze items in categories. If we take a look at our results, we can observe that there's an overall preference for native speaker teachers in two categories. They also reject the effect of nativeness in other categories, but these results are not clear. So from taking a look at individual items within each category, we came up with the following conclusion. This specific research should be based on specific items rather than on categories, because they shed more light on the topic. So taking this into consideration, we took a look at the individual items, as we have been previously mentioned in the results section. Therefore, taking a look at individual items, we came up with the following table in which we will display just the positive aspects links to each type of teacher. In the case of Basque and English native speaker teachers, students believe that they would better for the teaching of vocabulary, listening, fluency, grammar and pronunciation, and for the assessment of writing, speaking, and reading. They would also perceive as creators of more positive attitudes towards the places where English and Basque were spoken and towards their speakers. They would also perceive as the best option to teach the history, culture, and traditions linked to each language. In the case of non-native speaker teachers, they were perceived as better for the assessment of listening and also as good examples of how to learn English or Basque. They would also regard it as creators of less language difficulties and more positive attitudes towards learning English or Basque. And finally, all participants agreed with the fact that they don't care about teachers' origin as long as they are good teachers, so somehow placing teaching skills over nativeness. And this result is also particularly interesting because this is regardless of the language. So previous studies have also witnessed this in the case of English, but not in the case of a different language. So what our paper has brought to the research field is that these characteristics are not subject to English, but subject to nativeness because they are present in a language which is other than English. And now, before finishing our presentation, we would like to mention some limitations and to make some suggestions for further research in case someone is interested in following this path. So first, our conclusions are just limited to our context, which is the Basque Autonomous Country, and to our minority language, which is Basque. So it would be interesting to replicate this study in a different context and with a different language to observe if these characteristics are also present in that minority language and in English, or just context specific. Our conclusions are also limited to just our participants' profile, because we just analyze secondary and high school students. So it would be interesting to replicate the study and gather data from different students, like university students or adult learners, to see if these perceptions change depending on students' setting or students' age. And before finishing the presentation, we would like to just indicate some pedagogical implications of our work. So our data reveals that our students highly appreciate team teaching approaches where both native speaker teachers and non-native speaker teachers work together, and this regardless of the language. So this is usually applied in private English language academies, at least here in Spain, but not in schools. So it would be interesting to apply this in public schools, both with English and with Basque or another minority language. And finally, we feel that it is necessary to vindicate non-native speaker teachers' place in language teaching, because teaching abilities and capacities are not subject to nativeness. So it is more important being a good teacher regardless of your native or non-native condition. So this has been our presentation. Thank you for listening and feel free to ask any question.